Sometimes the life you have been searching for is quietly waiting in a place the world forgot to notice. Rain swept across the winding highway leading into Maple Ridge, turning the blacktop into a mirror of gray clouds and distant pine trees swaying gently in the autumn wind. Most drivers hurried past, eager to reach home before the storm grew stronger, but one faded blue Ford pickup slowed instead. Ethan Walker tightened his grip on the steering wheel as windshield wipers pushed away sheets of rain, one steady rhythm at a time. A half-finished wooden rocking horse rested carefully on the passenger seat beside a grocery bag filled with flour, milk, and chocolate chips. Sophie had asked if they could bake cookies together after dinner, and Ethan had promised they would. Ever since losing his wife 4 years earlier, he had learned that promises made to an 8-year-old girl mattered more than almost anything else. Just beyond the next bend, a dark luxury sport utility vehicle sat quietly on the gravel shoulder with its hood raised toward the stormy sky. Thin wisps of steam curled into the cold air, while a lone woman stood beside the engine compartment, pulling her jacket tighter against the rain. Ethan eased his truck onto the shoulder without hesitation. He grabbed the old red toolbox that had traveled with him for nearly 15 years and stepped into the steady drizzle. The scent of wet asphalt, damp cedar, and fallen maple leaves filled the cool afternoon air as thunder rolled softly across the distant hills. "Looks like today picked the wrong time to quit on you," he said with a gentle smile. The woman looked up, brushing a strand of blonde hair away from her face beneath a soaked knit cap. Her gray eyes carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who had not truly rested in a very long time. "I was hoping it would fix itself," she answered with a tired laugh. Ethan smiled. "If engines worked that way, mechanics like me would all be out of business." She stepped aside while he examined the engine with calm confidence. His hands moved naturally from one hose to another until he noticed a loose coolant clamp that had gradually slipped out of place. It was a simple repair, but one capable of leaving anyone stranded for hours. "Good news," Ethan said after tightening the clamp with an old wrench polished smooth by years of use. "Nothing expensive." Relief softened the woman's face. "You figured that out faster than roadside assistance ever could." Ethan closed the hood gently before wiping rainwater from his hands with a worn shop towel. "Sometimes old tools teach you everything you need to know." She watched him quietly for a moment, noticing the patience in every movement, the absence of hurry, the complete lack of expectation. Most people she met wanted something the moment they recognized opportunity. This man had not even asked her name. "I am Claire," she said softly, extending her hand. "Ethan." Their handshake was simple, warm, and genuine. "Thank you for stopping." Ethan shrugged lightly. "If my daughter were stranded somewhere, I would hope somebody would stop for her too." Claire lowered her eyes for just a second before smiling again. It had been years since anyone had helped her without first recognizing the company she led, the fortune she controlled, or the headlines attached to her name. To Ethan, she was simply another traveler caught in the rain. As the engine started smoothly, she exhaled a quiet breath she had been holding far longer than she realized. Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked nearly half a mile away beneath a row of tall pine trees. Inside, a man wearing a dark business suit lowered a camera after taking several photographs through the rain-speckled windshield. He reached for his phone and spoke in a calm voice. "I found her. She is still in Maple Ridge, and she has no idea someone has been following her." The rain finally gave way to a clear autumn morning, leaving Maple Ridge wrapped in crisp air that smelled of damp pine, fresh earth, and wood smoke drifting lazily from stone chimneys. Sunlight spilled across the quiet streets, warming the colorful maple leaves scattered along the sidewalks like patches of gold and crimson. Claire stood on the porch of a small rental cabin overlooking the edge of town, holding a steaming mug of coffee as she listened to something she had almost forgotten existed. Silence. There were no ringing telephones, no elevators opening every few seconds, no endless conversations about quarterly earnings or shareholder expectations. Only birds singing from the oak trees and the distant sound of a church bell echoing through the valley. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the peaceful rhythm to settle into her heart. It felt unfamiliar, almost impossible, that the world could continue turning without asking anything from her. Her phone vibrated inside the pocket of her jacket. She glanced at the screen before quietly placing it face down on the porch railing without answering. For the first time in years, someone else's schedule would have to wait. Across town, Ethan had already opened Walker Woodworks, the small family shop his father had built decades earlier. Warm rays of sunlight streamed through the old windows, illuminating tiny particles of cedar dust floating through the air like golden mist. The comforting scent of freshly cut wood filled every corner of the workshop, while Ethan carefully carved smooth edges onto a handcrafted rocking chair. Sophie sat nearby wearing oversized safety glasses that made Ethan smile every time he looked up. She was painting tiny blue flowers onto a wooden birdhouse with complete concentration. "Daddy," she said proudly, lifting it into the sunlight. "Do you think birds like blue?" Ethan smiled without stopping his work. "I think birds like houses built with love more than colors." Sophie nodded seriously as though she had just learned one of life's greatest secrets. A few minutes later, the bell above the workshop door chimed softly. Claire stepped inside, carrying a paper bag from the bakery across the street. The warm smell of fresh cinnamon rolls instantly filled the room. Sophie looked up first. "You are the lady from the rain," she said excitedly. Claire laughed gently. "I guess I am." Ethan wiped his hands on a clean shop towel before walking over. "Looks like your vehicle survived the night." Claire smiled. "Thanks to you. I thought this was the least I could do." She placed the warm pastries on the workbench. Ethan hesitated for only a moment before accepting them. Then breakfast just became much better. Sophie quickly pulled an extra wooden chair toward the small table near the window. "You have to sit with us." Claire looked toward Ethan, unsure whether she might be interrupting. He simply nodded. "There is always room for one more chair." They shared breakfast while sunlight slowly filled the workshop. Sophie happily described her school science project. Ethan listened with patient attention, and Claire found herself smiling more than she had in months. Nobody asked what she did for a living. Nobody searched her face, trying to remember where they had seen her before. They treated her exactly as they treated everyone else who walked through that old wooden door. After breakfast, Claire wandered through the workshop, gently running her fingers across handmade tables, rocking chairs, toy trains, and carved picture frames. Every piece carried tiny imperfections that somehow made them more beautiful. "You make everything by hand?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded. "Machines make things faster. Hands make them personal." Claire looked thoughtfully at the rows of finished furniture. She had spent years helping build towers of steel and glass that touched the sky, yet somehow none of them carried the quiet warmth of a single chair resting before her. Outside the workshop window, the black sedan from the previous afternoon remained parked beneath a tall maple tree. Its engine was off. Its windows remained closed. Inside, the same man watched patiently through a camera lens before writing another note inside a leather notebook. Whatever had brought Claire to Maple Ridge was no longer a secret waiting to be discovered. It had quietly become a story that someone else intended to control. By the middle of the following week, Maple Ridge no longer felt like a place Claire was simply visiting. It had quietly become the place where her breathing slowed, where every morning carried the scent of fresh pine instead of polished marble, and where the passing hours were measured by church bells instead of meeting schedules. The little rental cabin had begun to feel less like temporary shelter and more like the first real home she had experienced in years. Every sunrise painted the surrounding hills with soft shades of gold while birds gathered outside her porch railing, completely unaware that the woman watching them had spent the last decade leading one of the largest companies in the country. That morning, she found herself walking toward Walker Woodworks carrying nothing except a small basket of homemade blueberry muffins baked from a recipe the elderly woman at the general store had insisted she try. As she stepped inside, the familiar aroma of cedar, varnish, and freshly brewed coffee welcomed her before anyone spoke a single word. Ethan looked up from shaping the curved arm of a rocking chair and smiled with quiet familiarity. "You are becoming a regular customer." Claire laughed softly. "I am beginning to think that is not such a bad thing." Before Ethan could answer, Sophie hurried across the workshop holding a measuring tape almost as long as her arm. "Miss Claire, Daddy says I finally get to help build a bird feeder today. Will you help too?" Claire glanced toward Ethan, who simply nodded. "Only if you do not mind getting a little sawdust on your sweater." "I think I could survive that," she replied with a smile. For the next 2 hours, the three of them worked side by side beneath the warm afternoon sunlight pouring through the workshop windows. Sophie carefully sanded rough edges while Ethan patiently demonstrated each step, never rushing, never raising his voice, treating every mistake as another opportunity to learn. Claire found herself smiling each time Sophie celebrated the smallest accomplishment, whether it was driving a nail perfectly straight or brushing away sawdust with exaggerated pride. The quiet rhythm of ordinary life wrapped gently around her, and for the first time in years, she realized how exhausted she had been without ever admitting it. Later that afternoon, Ethan closed the workshop early so they could walk to Miller's orchard just outside town. Rows of apple trees stretched across rolling hills beneath a brilliant blue sky, while crisp autumn air carried the sweet fragrance of ripe fruit and dry leaves. Sophie raced ahead with a woven basket, determined to find the biggest apple in the entire orchard. Ethan watched her with a quiet smile before turning toward Claire. She has always believed the biggest apple tastes the sweetest. Claire looked toward the laughing little girl weaving between the trees. Does it? Ethan shrugged gently. Not usually, but I have learned some lessons are better discovered than explained. Claire lowered her eyes thoughtfully. You seem to have an answer for everything. Ethan laughed quietly. Not even close. Life has simply taught me which questions matter. They continued walking between the trees in comfortable silence until Claire finally asked the question she had been carrying for days. Do you ever wish you had left Maple Ridge? Ethan paused before answering. He looked across the hills glowing beneath the afternoon sun, then towards Sophie, who waved excitedly after finding another apple she declared perfect. There were times I thought happiness had to be somewhere else, he said softly. Then I realized happiness was growing right beside me while I was busy looking farther away. Claire felt those words settle deep inside her heart, because she suddenly understood something she had never allowed herself to believe. Every promotion, every award, every new skyscraper her company had built had taken her farther from the simple life she secretly wanted. Neither of them noticed the dark sedan parked quietly along the country road overlooking the orchard. The man inside lowered his camera after capturing another photograph, then opened his laptop where a headline had already begun taking shape, waiting only for the right moment to reveal that the woman smiling beneath the apple trees was not an ordinary visitor at all. The peaceful rhythm of Maple Ridge continued through the following days as though time itself had chosen to slow down. Every morning Claire walked the quiet streets before sunrise, passing the old white church, the family-owned bakery, and the weathered storefronts where neighbors greeted one another by name. The cool autumn air carried the comforting scent of fresh bread, pine trees, and distant fireplaces, and each familiar sound reminded her how different this place was from the world she had left behind. She no longer reached for her phone the moment she woke. Instead, she listened to birds singing above the town square and watched sunlight spill across the mountains surrounding the valley. It was a life she never imagined she would miss before she had even left it. By late morning, she arrived at Walker Woodworks carrying 2 cups of coffee, knowing Ethan always skipped breakfast whenever he became absorbed in a project. The bell above the workshop door chimed softly as she stepped inside. Ethan looked up from carefully fitting the curved backrest onto a handcrafted rocking chair, his sleeves rolled above his forearms, tiny flecks of cedar dust catching the warm light streaming through the windows. You are beginning to know my bad habits, he said with a quiet smile. Claire handed him one of the cups. Someone has to make sure you remember to eat. Sophie looked up from the workbench where she was painting tiny white flowers onto another birdhouse. Daddy forgets lunch almost every day, she announced proudly, as though revealing a family secret. Ethan laughed softly while accepting the coffee. I see I have lost this argument already. The 3 of them spent another peaceful afternoon together. Claire helped Sophie organize wooden toys waiting to be polished, while Ethan patiently explained how different types of wood each carried their own character. Oak is strong, he said, running his hand across a smooth board. Maple is dependable. Cedar carries its own scent forever. Claire smiled thoughtfully. People are not very different. Ethan looked at her for a brief moment before nodding. The best ones stay true to who they are, even after life leaves a few marks. His words lingered in her thoughts long after the conversation moved on. Just as the afternoon sun reached its brightest point, Claire's phone vibrated inside her jacket. She stepped quietly outside before answering. Claire, came the familiar voice of her chief operating officer, unusually tense. The board has scheduled an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. We have delayed the Maple Ridge redevelopment vote long enough. Claire looked. toward the workshop window where Ethan and Sophie were laughing over a crooked birdhouse that somehow leaned to one side. "I told everyone I needed more time," she replied calmly. "There is no more time," the voice answered. "Investors are asking questions. The acquisition documents are ready. Once you approve them, demolition planning begins immediately." Claire remained silent. She slowly lifted her eyes toward the peaceful streets stretching beyond the workshop, imagining luxury hotels and commercial towers replacing every familiar corner she had come to love. "Nothing happens until I say it does," she answered quietly before ending the call. She stood beneath a tall maple tree while golden leaves drifted gently around her boots. For the first time in her career, the weight on her shoulders did not come from financial decisions. It came from people whose faces she now knew. When she returned inside, Ethan immediately noticed something had changed. "Everything all right?" he asked gently. Claire forced a small smile. "Work has a way of finding people, no matter how far they drive." Ethan nodded with quiet understanding. "Sometimes the hardest part is deciding whether work serves your life or your life serves your work." Claire looked into his calm eyes without answering because deep inside, she already knew the answer. Neither of them noticed the same black sedan parked quietly across the street beside the old library. The man inside closed his notebook after receiving a message on his phone. A single line appeared across the screen. "Publish the story tomorrow morning. She cannot stay hidden any longer." Saturday arrived dressed in brilliant shades of crimson and gold as Maple Ridge prepared for its annual Harvest Festival, a tradition that had brought generations of neighbors together long before anyone could remember who started it. The streets filled with handcrafted decorations, rows of pumpkins, woven baskets overflowing with apples, and strings of warm white lights hanging between old brick buildings. The air carried the irresistible aroma of cinnamon, fresh cider, smoked barbecue, and homemade pies cooling on wooden tables while children laughed as they chased one another through piles of colorful leaves. Ethan had volunteered to repair the wooden stage at the center of the town square before the musicians arrived, just as he did every year. Sophie followed close behind, carrying a basket filled with bright orange ribbons, carefully tying bows along the railings with complete concentration. Claire appeared a few minutes later wearing a soft cream sweater, faded blue jeans, and comfortable brown boots, looking like any other visitor enjoying the festival instead of one of the country's most recognizable business leaders. The moment Sophie spotted her, she ran across the square with a joyful smile. "You came," she said, wrapping her arms around Claire without hesitation. Claire laughed warmly as she returned the hug. "I would not miss today for anything." Ethan climbed down from the stage after tightening the final bolt and smiled when he saw them together. "Perfect timing," he said. "The hard work is finally finished." Sophie grinned mischievously. "That means now we get to have fun." The three of them spent the afternoon wandering through rows of handmade crafts, greeting friendly vendors who offered slices of warm apple pie and tiny cups of fresh cider. Claire admired quilts stitched by local families, watched blacksmiths shape glowing metal beside portable forges, and listened to an elderly fiddle player performing songs that had echoed through Maple Ridge for decades. Everywhere she looked, she saw neighbors helping one another without expecting recognition. The simplicity of it all felt richer than any elegant charity gala she had attended in the city. Later, they stopped beside a booth displaying handcrafted wooden toys where Sophie proudly pointed toward a bird feeder nearly identical to the one she had helped build. "Ours is better," she whispered confidently. Ethan smiled. "That is because yours carries fingerprints instead of factory marks." Claire looked at the little bird feeder, then at Ethan. "Maybe that is why handmade things feel different. They remember who cared enough to make them." Ethan nodded quietly. "People are not very different." As the sun drifted lower across the valley, music filled the square and couples slowly gathered near the stage beneath glowing strands of lights. Sophie looked from Ethan to Claire before taking each of them gently by the hand. "Everybody is dancing," she said. "You two should dance too." Claire laughed nervously. "I am not sure your father wants to." Ethan smiled with quiet embarrassment. "I have learned it is difficult to say no when an 8-year-old is making the request." Claire accepted his outstretched hand, and together they stepped onto the edge of the dance floor while a gentle country melody floated through the cool evening air. Around them, neighbors smiled, children twirled beneath the lights, and autumn leaves drifted softly across the square. Neither Ethan nor Claire spoke for several moments. They simply shared the peaceful silence that had become so natural between them. Finally, Ethan looked at her with calm sincerity. "You seem happier every day you stay here." Claire met his eyes, feeling the truth rise before she could stop it. "I think this town helped me remember the person I used to be." Before Ethan could answer, the bright flash of a camera briefly reflected from the second-floor balcony of the historic hotel overlooking the square. Far above the celebration, the same man who had followed Claire for days quietly lowered his camera after capturing the photograph that would soon appear across business news outlets nationwide. He closed his laptop with quiet satisfaction because by sunrise the woman dancing beneath the festival lights would no longer belong only to Maple Ridge. Sunday morning arrived beneath a blanket of low-gray clouds that seemed to settle gently over Maple Ridge, as though the town itself sensed something had changed during the night. Ethan unlocked the front door of Walker Woodworks just after sunrise, while the familiar scent of cedar drifted through the cool autumn air. Sophie carefully arranged several handcrafted birdhouses inside the front display window, humming the same melody the festival band had played the evening before. Everything looked exactly the same as it had for years, yet an uneasy stillness lingered over the streets. Across town, Claire stood alone on the porch of her rental cabin holding a mug of untouched coffee. Her cell phone had not stopped ringing since dawn. News alerts flashed across the screen one after another. Business reporters wanted interviews. Television networks demanded statements. Members of the board had already left 12 voicemail messages. She finally answered one call. "Claire, where are you?" her chief operating officer asked urgently. "The photographs are everywhere. Every major business outlet knows you have been living in Maple Ridge." Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment. "I know. The board is sending representatives immediately. Reporters are already on their way." Before she could respond, the distant sound of several approaching vehicles echoed along the highway leading into town. She looked toward the valley below and watched a line of black sport utility vehicles slowly make their way down the main road, followed closely by satellite news vans carrying large broadcast antennas. Her quiet refuge had finally been discovered. Within minutes, Maple Ridge filled with unfamiliar faces. Camera crews unloaded equipment near the courthouse while professionally dressed executives hurried toward the town square, carrying leather briefcases and tablet computers. Curious residents gathered on sidewalks, whispering quietly to one another as national news anchors began setting up live broadcasts. Ethan stepped outside the workshop after hearing the commotion. Sophie looked toward the growing crowd with wide eyes. "Daddy, why are all those television people here?" Ethan shook his head gently. "I do not know, sweetheart." Just then, every television inside the diner, the bakery, and the general store switched to the same breaking news report. Claire's photograph appeared across every screen beside the headline identifying her as Claire Montgomery, billionaire chief executive officer of Montgomery Holdings, whose company had been quietly negotiating one of the largest redevelopment projects in the region. The news anchor explained that Maple Ridge sat directly within the proposed expansion zone scheduled for approval within days. Inside the workshop, silence replaced every sound except the slow ticking of the old wall clock. Sophie looked from the television to Ethan. "Miss Claire is the lady from the news?" she whispered. Ethan stared at the screen for several long seconds before quietly answering, "Yes." The familiar sound of footsteps crossed the wooden porch outside. Claire appeared in the open doorway wearing a tailored navy coat that one of her assistants had insisted she put on before facing the cameras. The elegant clothing looked strangely unfamiliar against the warmth of the small workshop. She took one hesitant step forward. "Ethan," she said softly, "I wanted you to hear the truth from me." Ethan looked into her eyes with calm disappointment rather than anger. "When?" he asked quietly. Claire blinked in confusion. "When what? When were you planning to tell me who you really were?" The question hung in the air between them, while every carefully prepared explanation disappeared from Claire's mind. She had negotiated billion-dollar agreements without hesitation, yet now she could not find a single sentence capable of repairing the trust quietly broken by her silence. Outside, the gathered townspeople watched without speaking. Even the reporters lowered their microphones for a moment as though they understood they were witnessing something more important than another business headline. Sometimes hearts are not broken by lies alone. Sometimes they break because the truth arrived only after trust had already begun walking away. The silence that settled over Walker Woodworks lingered long after the reporters lowered their cameras and the executives stepped back from the doorway. Maple Ridge had always been the kind of town where people believed actions spoke louder than headlines. Yet now every whispered conversation carried the same unanswered question. Ethan closed the workshop earlier than usual and drove home beneath a sky painted with fading shades of orange and gray. Sophie sat quietly in the passenger seat, tracing invisible circles across the fogged window while fallen leaves danced behind the truck. Neither of them turned on the radio. Neither of them wanted to hear another report repeating Claire's name. As they crossed the old, covered bridge leading toward their cabin, Sophie finally broke the silence. "Daddy," she asked softly, "did Miss Claire become a different person today?" Ethan kept his eyes on the winding road ahead before answering. "No, sweetheart." Sophie looked at him with quiet curiosity. "Then why does everybody seem different now?" Ethan smiled sadly. "Sometimes people change the way they look at someone after learning something new. That does not always mean the person changed." Sophie rested her head against the seat. "I still think she is kind." Ethan nodded gently. "So do I." That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Ethan stepped onto the porch carrying a warm mug of coffee. The crisp autumn air smelled of pine trees, dry leaves, and distant fireplaces while crickets filled the quiet valley with their steady evening song. He thought about every conversation he had shared with Claire, every laugh she had shared with Sophie, every peaceful afternoon inside the workshop. None of those memories felt dishonest. Yet every one of them now carried a question he could not ignore. Why had she believed the truth would make him walk away before giving him the chance to decide for himself? Across town, the conference room inside the Maple Ridge Inn had been transformed into a temporary corporate office. Executives surrounded Claire with legal documents, financial projections, and redevelopment contracts spread neatly across a polished wooden table. Her chief operating officer spoke first. "Tomorrow morning the board expects your final approval. Delaying again will create serious consequences." Another executive slid a thick folder toward her. "Every investor is waiting for your signature." Claire stared silently at the photographs attached to the proposal. Streets she had walked. Stores where neighbors greeted one another by name. The orchard where Sophie had laughed beneath rows of apple trees. Walker Woodworks stood clearly marked on one of the redevelopment maps. She slowly closed the folder without saying a word. "This town is not empty land," she said quietly. "It is home." An older board member folded his hands. "Our responsibility is to maximize opportunity." Claire looked directly at him. Opportunity should never require erasing someone else's life. The room fell completely silent. No one argued immediately because they had never heard her speak with such quiet certainty. Later that night, Claire drove alone to Ethan's cabin. She left the elegant company vehicle behind and borrowed an ordinary pickup from the local rental office, hoping to arrive not as a chief executive officer, but simply as herself. She found Ethan sitting on the porch beneath the warm glow of a single light, his untouched coffee resting beside him. Claire stopped several feet away, respecting the distance between them. "I am not asking you to forgive me tonight," she said softly. "I only wanted to tell you that I am sorry." Ethan remained quiet for several long moments before finally speaking. "I am not hurt because you are successful." Claire slowly lifted her eyes toward him. "Then why?" His voice remained calm, steady, and completely free of anger. "Because every day you trusted me with your laughter, your friendship, and your kindness, but never with your truth. You decided for me that I could not handle knowing who you really were." Claire felt tears quietly fill her eyes as his words settled into the stillness surrounding them. There was nothing she could say because every sentence he spoke came from honesty rather than accusation. The porch light cast long shadows across the wooden steps while neither of them moved. Sometimes the deepest distance between two hearts is not measured in miles or money. Sometimes it is measured by the single truth that was never given the chance to be shared. The following morning, the skyline of downtown Chicago reflected pale sunlight across the towering glass headquarters of Montgomery Holdings. But for Claire, the familiar view no longer represented success. It felt strangely distant, as though she had returned to someone else's life instead of her own. She walked through the executive floor where assistants greeted her respectfully. Elevators opened in perfect silence, and every polished surface reflected the image of the leader everyone expected her to be. Yet the only picture she could see in her mind was Ethan standing quietly on his porch beneath a single light, speaking with calm honesty instead of anger. Inside the boardroom, directors, attorneys, and investors were already waiting around the long glass conference table. Architectural renderings covered one wall, displaying luxury hotels, upscale shopping districts, and office buildings planned for the land surrounding Maple Ridge. The chairman welcomed Claire with a professional smile before sliding a leather folder toward her. "Everything is ready," he said. "One signature, and we begin the most profitable expansion in company history." Claire remained standing rather than taking her usual seat. She slowly opened the folder, studying the detailed maps before closing it again without turning a single page. "Before anyone asks for my decision," she said quietly, "I would like to ask a question." The room grew still. How many people sitting here have actually walked through Maple Ridge? No hands moved. How many of you have spoken to the families whose homes appear as numbered lots inside these documents? Again, no one answered. An executive finally leaned forward. "With respect, personal relationships cannot determine corporate strategy." Claire nodded gently. "That is exactly what I believed for many years." She looked toward the large window overlooking the city before continuing. "Then I met people who measured success differently. A father who builds every chair as though someone he loves will sit in it. A little girl who believes every promise should be kept. A town where neighbors still know each other's names." The chairman folded his hands. "Our responsibility is to shareholders." Claire met his eyes calmly. "Leadership also carries a responsibility to humanity." Another investor spoke with growing concern. "Rejecting this project could cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars." Claire answered without hesitation. "Money can always be earned again. Trust cannot." She removed her company identification badge and carefully placed it beside the unsigned contract. No dramatic gesture. No raised voice. Only quiet certainty. "Effective immediately, I am suspending the Maple Ridge redevelopment project." A wave of disbelief moved around the room. Before anyone could respond, she continued, "If protecting that community means the board no longer has confidence in my leadership, then I will submit my resignation after ensuring an orderly transition." Complete silence settled across the boardroom. The chairman stared at her for several moments before lowering his eyes toward the untouched contract. Claire gathered only a small leather notebook and the framed photograph she had quietly placed on her desk the previous week. It showed Ethan and Sophie smiling beneath the glowing lights of the Harvest Festival, completely unaware someone had captured a moment that would forever change her understanding of success. Hours later, every major news network reported that Montgomery Holdings had indefinitely canceled the Maple Ridge redevelopment project, while Claire Montgomery announced her decision to step away from the position she had spent years building. Back in Maple Ridge, Ethan was repairing the porch swing outside Mrs. Harper's farmhouse when neighbors began calling with the same astonishing news. He listened quietly without interrupting, then looked across the peaceful valley where autumn sunlight rested gently upon the trees. Mrs. Harper smiled kindly as she folded her knitting into a basket. "Young man," she said softly, "sometimes the strongest apology is not spoken with words. Sometimes it is written by the life someone chooses after they know what it will cost." Ethan looked toward the distant hills without answering. But for the first time since Claire's secret had been revealed, the weight inside his heart no longer felt quite as heavy. 6 months passed, and winter quietly gave way to the gentle warmth of early spring. Maple Ridge awakened beneath clear blue skies as wildflowers covered the hillsides. Fresh green leaves returned to the maple trees, and birds filled the morning air with cheerful songs. Life had settled back into the peaceful rhythm the town had always known. Walker Woodworks had become busier than ever, not because Ethan had advertised his work, but because people from neighboring counties had begun traveling to Maple Ridge after hearing stories about the craftsman whose furniture carried as much heart as skill. Every rocking chair, dining table, and wooden toy that left his workshop reflected the same quiet patience that had always guided his life. Sophie had grown a little taller during the winter, and every afternoon after school, she proudly helped her father sand birdhouses and organize tools, insisting she was now his official business partner. One bright Saturday morning, Ethan stood outside the workshop applying the final coat of finish to a handcrafted porch swing when he heard the familiar sound of an old pickup truck approaching slowly along the gravel road. He looked up and immediately recognized the driver. Claire stepped out wearing faded blue jeans, a cream sweater, and the same weathered brown jacket she had worn on the rainy afternoon they first met. There were no luxury vehicles following behind her, no security team, no reporters waiting with cameras. Only a few carefully packed boxes secured in the bed of the pickup. Before Ethan could speak, Sophie rushed through the workshop door with a joyful laugh and wrapped her arms tightly around Claire. "You came back," she said with complete certainty, as though she had never doubted it for a single day. Claire knelt to hug her, smiling through tears that quietly filled her gray eyes. "I promised myself that if I ever found the place where I truly belonged, I would never stop coming home." Ethan walked toward them slowly, the familiar scent of cedar wood still clinging to his shirt. For several peaceful moments, neither of them spoke. The spring breeze gently stirred the porch swing, while wind chimes hanging beneath the workshop roof played a soft melody that blended with distant birdsong. Finally, Claire looked at him with quiet honesty. "I hope there is still room for me here." Ethan smiled, not with excitement, but with the calm certainty that had always defined him. "There has always been room. The only thing missing was time." Over the following weeks, Claire purchased the small cabin she had rented and carefully restored it without changing the character that had first captured her heart. She quietly worked with local leaders to support scholarships for students, preserve historic buildings, and help small family businesses remain part of the town's future, always choosing to remain in the background rather than seeking recognition. She no longer measured success by board meetings or financial reports. She measured it by shared dinners, quiet evenings, and neighbors who stopped to wave as they drove past. One evening, as the setting sun painted the valley in warm shades of gold, Ethan, Claire, and Sophie sat together on the handcrafted porch swing overlooking the rolling hills beyond Maple Ridge. The air carried the sweet fragrance of blooming wildflowers and freshly cut grass, while the last rays of daylight settled gently across the peaceful landscape. Sophie leaned against Claire's shoulder before looking up with the same honest innocence that had changed so many lives. "Can I ask you something?" Claire smiled warmly. "Anything." Sophie hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Would it be all right if I stopped calling you Miss Claire?" Claire felt tears gather once more as she gently brushed a loose strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. "You can call me whatever makes your heart happy." Sophie smiled brighter than the evening sky. "Then I would like to call you Mom." Claire quietly covered her mouth as tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sadness, but from gratitude she had never believed she would experience. Ethan reached for her hand, and this time there was no fear, no hidden truth, and no distance left between them. Together they watched the sun disappear beyond the hills, understanding that the greatest blessing had never been wealth, power, or success. It had always been the quiet dignity of a good man, the unwavering faith of a little girl, and the extraordinary grace of discovering that sometimes home is not the place where life begins, but the place where love finally asks you to stay.